when a murder is left unsolved.
You always think, have we missed something? What have we missed?
And a killer is on the loose.
To look at that individual and think he's capable of doing what he did is quite unbelievable.
He carried out the last act of absolute total control, which is murder.
Britain's cold case detectives will never give up.
What else can we do? What else should we do to serve the family who've lost a loved one?
He's obviously driven down here in the car and deposited her in the undergrowth.
That's the unanswered question, isn't it? Why? Why did he do it?
No matter how long it takes.
This was the last throw of the forensic dice.
They'll investigate every angle and uncover every clue.
That seemed to be the missing piece of the jigsaw.
Until the killer is caught at last.
One hurdle after another, we were doggedly determined to succeed.
A case like that will stay with you for the rest of your life.
All the people in Orkney were just in total disbelief. You would not believe this would happen. The common theory on the island was, this has nothing to do with the island. Obviously, he's an incomer. He hadn't fallen out with anybody on the island. To think that somebody would walk into a restaurant and assassinate a waiter, unbelievable.
26-year-old Bangladeshi waiter Shamsuddin Mahmood, or Shamul as he is known, is at work in the Mumtaz restaurant when a lone gunman walks in and shoots him.
It was a beautiful summer's evening. I got a telephone call advising me that there had been a murder in Kirkwall, which is in Orkney. We don't have murders every day in the Northern Constabulary, but I suppose in the role I was in at that time, if anything serious happened outlying, I was going to be the one getting the phone call. The gunman was somebody wearing balaclava, combat gear, unidentifiable, basically. He calmly walked up to the waiter who was serving, walked quickly out of the restaurant, ran away and disappeared.
I'm John Ferguson. I used to run the local radio station in Orkney, and I lived there for just over 20 years. We didn't bother covering the courts because nothing ever came up there apart from a bit of vandalism. Crime just wasn't really part of Orkney's repertoire. It just didn't happen. The Orkney police were country policemen, not used to the big crimes, so as soon as something significant happened, then the big boys were drafted in from south.
People obviously saw us as the enemy. The police would not necessarily have been seen as friends that they could welcome to the island. It would be more here to carry out an investigation into horrific crime. And even looking back now after all these years, it's difficult to comprehend that it actually happened.
The restaurant was right in the sort of heart of the town, and the little narrow street that leads up through Kirkwall from the harbour to the cathedral, a very busy, popular kind of thoroughfare where people walked. So it was a kind of warren of places, and you could easily get lost.
On the night of the murder, the Mumtaz restaurant was busy with diners enjoying a Friday night out.
So this is the lane that the gunman walked up to get to the restaurant. It's a fairly quiet lane. This is your ideal route if you don't want to be seen. So this is us just approaching the main street. The restaurant is on our right, quite busy now, and it would have been quite busy on that June night. If you came through the main thoroughfare, dressed in a balaclava and combat gear, at 7 o'clock on a beautiful June evening, would make you stand out. He didn't pause, he didn't look in the window. He simply walked in the door, walked over to Shamul and shot him at point blank range. The witnesses in the restaurant, the waitress and the other witnesses, they ran down this lane, and when they got to this point here, they would have glanced to the right and they would have seen the gunman go up 3 steps and down the lane. At that point, they thought, this guy has got a gun, let's not pursue it any further.
At the time, there hadn't been a murder in a quarter of a century, and all of Orkney had that kind of safe, supportive feeling that you get in a community that has no fear of violence. We couldn't really get our heads around it.
The forensic team arrived to assess the crime scene.
We found that there was a slug embedded in the wall. The bullet went in his left eye, executed behind his right ear, and then lodged itself in the wall. The casing for the bullet had ejected from the weapon and it was lying on the floor.
Firearms expert Constable Eddie Ross is one of the first local police officers to arrive at the crime scene.
He was quickly able to tell them that the bullet, which was removed from the wall, was a 9mm bullet. The casing, which was recovered from the floor, from markings on that, he was able to say that had been manufactured in the Kirky arsenal, which is in India.
I was the Aberdeen bureau chief of the Scottish Daily Record, which at that time was Scotland's biggest selling newspaper. Well, I had a very good network of contacts on the island. The murder happened at the height of the tourist season, the busiest time of year on the island. The victim really was completely unknown. He was a waiter, a Bangladeshi waiter in a local Indian restaurant, going about his business on a Friday night. The customers at the time thought it was a prank. They thought it was some sort of joke. And then they suddenly realised it was very, very horrifically real. I mean, it was like something out of a TV series or a movie. I mean, that sort of thing should never happen in a wee place like Orkney.
The killer had the demeanour and presence and singularity of mind to go in, commit the act, and disappear. That didn't sound like some local guy who had a grudge. That kind of looked like somebody who really knew what they were doing. It had all the elements of a hit.
The killer of 26-year-old Shamsuddin Mahmood remains at large. The local community is struggling to come to terms with such a shocking tragedy.
We didn't know the man had been shot, but he was one of the seasonal staff who worked at the restaurant. He'd been there the year before, and he'd come back that year and had been there for a few weeks before it happened. There was a Chinese restaurant and there was an Indian restaurant, and they kind of kept themselves to themselves. We had that's probably the one part of the community that we didn't have any inside source on.
Still, I cannot comprehend why it has happened to him. What grudge one can have against him. He was a baby brother, and every member of the family was very fond of him. So it has happened to him in a faraway country. It was, no one could come to terms with it.
We didn't know why this was carried out. Your thoughts go through, has this guy who's come in, has he got a history? Was he doing something wrong in previous places that had been? And was the local speculation correct that he had done something wrong and somebody was sent to take him out? Was he having an affair? Was he dealing in drugs? Was he money laundering? All of these things were explored, and nothing untoward was found about him. He wasn't a drug user. He hadn't fallen out with anybody on the island. We sent teams to restaurants where he had worked to try and find out, is there something happened there? Would that give us a motive for somebody coming onto the island to take him out? And the answer to all of these inquiries were nothing.
There was no racism towards people of a different ethnicity or skin colour in Orkney. There was tension between incomers and locals, and they seemed to be welcomed to the community. There weren't enough numbers to be threatening or to change the culture or anything. And I would have said that it was a place that was very at ease with other races and cultures.
What we did initially was we effectively sealed off the island. We didn't prevent folk coming, but we got details of everybody arriving and leaving. We then moved to the house-to-house phase, and we got a house-to-house team onto the island, and they visited every household in Kirkwall, filled in questionnaires, got descriptive forms for every male that was in a certain age range. We then extended it to the whole of the island, and we sent questionnaires to every household everywhere on the island asking for information. If we knew somebody was staying in a guest house on the relevant date, if somebody stayed in New Zealand or Australia or anywhere, the local officers in Australia and New Zealand visited that person and filled in a questionnaire to find out whether they had anything relevant.
Anyone could arrive in Orkney in the summer and nobody would play a blind piece of notice, no matter how they arrived. Fishing boats come and go, leisure craft come and go, a lot of cruise liners in the summer. You could land in Orkney off a boat and wander up the street. Nobody would look twice at you. The scenario in our heads was that somebody had come in, committed the murder, and left.
The only evidence Angus has is the 9mm bullet and cartridge recovered from the crime scene.
Eddie Ross was well into his firearms. He was an expert, you could say. When he left the army, he joined the police, and a number of officers in every area were trained up to be firearms officers. So if something happened in a remote area, you would have an instant response.
We liked the police. They were a nice bunch. You could talk to them, you could, have a laugh with them. I was aware of Eddie. I knew him as a policeman.
His firearms expertise was utilised by us as the days went on. He was actually tasked with finding out where all the 9mm weapons were. So he would trace the weapons, take them in, test fire them to see whether they were the same.
There was a gun club in Orkney and there was a community of gun users. There was an element of, swapping guns, swapping ammunition, exchanges going on. Nothing to suggest it's anything illegal, but we knew there was a significant community in Orkney for whom a gun was a thing of beauty and of interest.
As the days went by, as the weeks and months went by, inquiries were carried out throughout the island, throughout the world, really. And that was just sifted through, and I suppose you could say that was kind of routine, looking for a vital piece of information.
We weren't told directly by the police, and word soon got out, and our contacts up there were telling us what was going on. The police had absolutely no leads to go on at all, apart from the description of the man in the balaclava with the dark hooded top, and that was it.
I had come into work at 8 in the morning, and Constable Ross had been coming off a night shift, and he said, oh, by the way, I've got a box of 9mm bullets. And I went, oh, very good. He went, no, 9mm bullets from the Kirky Arsenal. And I said, what? He told me that he'd got them from his friend James Spence. Spence had taken them from the army when he left the army, and he'd asked Constable Eddie Ross to dispose of them for him, and he had agreed to do this. When I asked Eddie about the quantities, he told me there was the 1 9mm box and 2 boxes of .22 bullets.
The thing about the bullet that killed Shamsuddin was that it was from a very precise batch. It was a very common bullet made en masse and bought by the British Army, but there was one batch of it that was suspect, and was meant to have been destroyed. But it looks like a box or some boxes were kept and found their way into private hands. And so there weren't many of those bullets in the world.
Angus asks Eddie's friend James Spence to come in and make a statement.
He said that he had given Eddie one box of 9mm and one box of .22 bullets. I knew that that was not what Eddie had said to me, but I didn't directly confront Mr. Spence. I said, "Are you sure about the quantities?" It was one box of 9mm and one box of .22. And he went, yeah, quite sure, that's the numbers that I got, and that's what I gave to Eddie. I knew after I'd spoken to Spence there was different numbers of boxes. Eddie had said 3 boxes in total. The other guy had said 2 boxes in total. So I knew one of them was lying. James Spence told me his story was that he had been in the Marines. When he was demobbed, he found these bullets in a drawer. He took them home because if he'd handed them at that point, he thought he might have got into trouble. Threw them in a drawer at his house and forgot about them till sometime later, and he asked if Eddie would be able to dispose of them for him. Eddie agreed to do this, so James Spence handed over the bullets to Eddie.
My name's Philip Boyce, and I'm a ballistic forensic scientist. During my career, I've seen many cases where ex-servicemen have had in their possession military ammunition that they have acquired illegally. Having said that, being an ex-serviceman, he could well have had access to ammunition legitimately. When military ammunition is actually manufactured, it has a shelf life of something like 5 to 10 years. If that ammunition has passed its shelf life, rather than destroying it, it is sold for use in the community. The number of guns in Orkney was quite high. Eddie Ross would have been aware of the number of guns that were in circulation, and he would have been aware of the types and calibers of each weapon and who held them.
Eddie disagrees with James about the number of .22 boxes of bullets, but both men agree that there is only one box of 9mm bullets.
The markings on the outside of the box will indicate where the ammunition came from and probably actually tell you the date of manufacture as well. Such bullets are normally packaged in at least a cardboard box of 50 cartridges, which is sealed. Whenever the seal is broken, it usually indicates that some cartridges have been removed.
So I said to him, right, Eddie, I need that box of bullets. And a short time later, he came back with the box of bullets. They were from the Kirky Arsenal, sealed in a box from the manufacturer. So clearly they were unopened, and the murder bullet could not have come from that box.
Angus is no closer to identifying the killer of Shamsuddin Mahmood. He is running out of time and resources.
If you don't get a motive or have a suspect within the first 2 or 3 days, it's likely that it's going to run on. The inquiry team had done their bit and they had been called back to do routine duties, and it was us that was left there. I think I've slept in every hotel bed in Orkney.
I think we were, at the time, pretty confident that this wouldn't be solved in Orkney, that the key to solving this murder lay in some distant land, either in England or in Bangladesh.
As the investigation into the ballistics continues, another line of inquiry emerges.
A couple of weeks prior to the murder, there was a report of somebody seen acting suspiciously in Paptail Woods, which is a local woodland there. The significant part of that was that the person that was seen was wearing clothing virtually identical to what the murderer was wearing. He looked like he was doing combat maneuvers, moving about between the trees, acting suspiciously. Witnesses were able to see him from a nearby house which overlooks the woods, and one witness in particular was using binoculars. So as you can see, there's a fairly distinctive gap here. You can get a good clear view right into the woods. The witnesses were viewing from this direction. So at that point, the witness got a very clear view of the T-shirt he was wearing and his face.
The witnesses do not recognize the man, but believe that they could identify him if they saw him again.
So because the girls got such a good view of him, in particular the one using binoculars, we arranged to have an e-fit prepared. That e-fit was circulated in the local Orkney newspaper. Eventually, the witness came forward to say that she had seen him enter the bakery. My colleagues sat in this tea room here, and they were keeping an eye on the bakery, which is across the road, and they were able to identify the person who had been in Papdale Woods. They were quite certain that that was the person that was going into the shop here. The girl identified this person to the police officers, and then the police officers subsequently identified this person as Michael Ross, who was the son of Constable Eddie Ross. Now that we have this information that Michael is identified as being the person in the woods, we asked Constable Ross to bring his son in, who was still 15 at this time, so that we could interview him. We allowed Constable Ross to sit in an interview. He sat there, he did not interfere with the interview, and Michael was quite clear it was not him that was in the woods. He's never been in Papdale Woods, and he didn't know what we were talking about, basically.
Angus decides to ask Michael where he was on the night of the murder.
We came off tape, went on another tape, and as a completely separate interview, we interviewed him about the murder. Again, his father was present, and he said that on the night of the murder, he could clearly remember where he was at the time because he heard the sirens racing to the scene. You could just hear the nino of the sirens, which isn't a common occurrence there. So he knew at that time he was in Papdale Estate, speaking to two of his friends who he had named.
Both of Michael's friends are questioned independently.
They were quite clear that they had not been speaking to Michael that night. They said Michael was a bit of a loner, he really wasn't a friend of theirs, but they certainly were not with him on that night. Once we had this information from Michael's friends where they were not providing the alibi that Michael thought they were, we took him in again and we said to Eddie, would you mind if we interviewed Michael? Fine with that, no problem. Although he was there in the next room, we spoke to Michael and immediately he said, yes, I was the person in Papdale Woods. He told us he was waiting for somebody to come out of the school. He named that person, who was a boyfriend of one of his ex-girlfriends. He told us that he was beating up his ex-girlfriend and he wanted to confront him about his conduct towards his ex-girlfriend.
On an island as small as Orkney, nothing stays secret for long. Here you have your local Bobby and his 15-year-old son is hauled in for questioning about the biggest murder on the island for decades. So obviously the rumour mill is going to go into overdrive again. Did he do it? Was he responsible? Was he involved at all?
Michael, when we interviewed him, did not really behave like you would expect a 15-year-old. He was not perturbed, he was cool, he was calm. He did not revert to his father saying, should I answer this? He answered every question we put to him, calmly. You know, no issues, no sweat, nothing. Really, that's not what you would expect from a 15-year-old schoolboy.
We heard that somebody had been seen in Pabdale Woods, dressed strangely, doing a kind of commando-type exercise. We knew pretty soon that that was thought to be Michael Ross who was doing that. But it became evident that the police were looking at the Rosses quite closely. And of course, everyone knew that Michael's dad was Eddie. Eddie was an ex-serviceman. Michael was kind of destined for the services. He was in the Army Cadets. They used to go shooting together. And Eddie had a cupboard full of guns at home.
As the investigation continues to establish the connection between the murder and Michael's behaviour in Pabdale Woods, there is an unexpected development.
James Spence changed his story and told the police that actually he'd given Eddie 3 boxes of ammunition. The Kirky ammunition sealed, the 2.2 ammunition, and also an open box of Kirky ammunition.
He told us, yep, I told you lies last time. There was actually 2 boxes of 9mm bullets. One opened with some out of it and one sealed. Obviously the box we got was the sealed box, and the question then was, where is this open box? He also told us that he had been approached by Constable Eddie Ross a total of 3 times since the murder happened. And he was told by Constable Ross, if the police ever approached him, he was to say there was only 1 9mm box. Spotlight was clearly beginning to focus on Constable Ross. There was clearly something not right there when he was going out, interfering with witnesses, telling them to tell us lies. It was looking likely that we had a problem with one of our own. Could Constable Ross be the murderer?
I mean, in a way, Eddie put himself in the frame because he was charged with going round and testing all the 9mm guns in Orkney. And he collected them in, he test-fired them. And only at the end of that did he take a box of ammunition from his cupboard, go in and say, I've got a batch of ammunition from the same batch that the killer's bullet came from.
We then had to enlist further firearms experts to come in and retest all of the weapons that had been fired by Constable Ross. So we knew that there was no trace of the murder weapon on the island, because you can tell by the markings of the bullet what weapon it was fired from.
When a bullet actually travels down a barrel of a gun, it obturates in what we call the rifling and leaves unique marks on the bullet which can be traced back to the actual firearm. At that period of time, 9mm pistols were more available than they are today, with them effectively being prohibited. It depends where you acquire them from, whether they're actually legitimate weapons or illegal weapons.
Eddie Ross is suspended from duty and his movements on the night of the murder carefully scrutinised.
Having looked into it in some detail, we were reasonably convinced, not completely, but we did not consider we had enough there to make Constable Ross a suspect. He lives a reasonable distance away from the restaurant. He was phoned almost immediately after it happened to turn out to come and be on duty, so it's not likely he'd have been able to get from the murder scene back home to be able to take that call. Although he was still there in the frame, why was he telling lies, asking this witness to tell lies? What was going on behind that? But we did not think that he was the murderer.
Eddie Ross is charged with perverting the course of justice. He pleads not guilty.
I went to the trial at the High Court in Inverness. It was actually very poorly attended in the public benches, not a lot of interest locally in Inverness, and not many people, apart from Eddie Ross's family, travelled through from Orkney. Eddie turned up every day, smartly dressed, suit and tie, military, police-like bearing, sat and listened to all the evidence. His defence was very simple, that he hadn't lied and that he had a sealed box of bullets, which he had given to the officers in good faith because they were the same type of bullets as that used in the murder, and that was it. What I do remember quite distinctly, that when he was found guilty by the jury, he showed absolutely no emotion at all. And when he was sentenced to 4 years, same reaction, no emotion. It's like he took it in the chin and walked out to serve his sentence.
From the moment Eddie picked up that bullet, he was the one who was asked to see what he could learn from the bullet. The moment he picked that up and saw that the numbers, he had a box of that at home. His blood must just have run cold. He must have thought that came from my gun cabinet. And if it wasn't him, who was it? Michael.
The murder of 26-year-old Shamsuddin Mahmood remains unsolved. Angus and his team have reached the end of their investigation, with the killer still at large.
During the years after I retired and had moved on, I would still sometimes think back to this case and, wonder, was it ever going to come into a successful prosecution? The purpose of the police is to investigate, obtain as much information as possible, then pass all the information to the prosecuting authority, and they decide whether they're going to prosecute or not. We obviously had this vital information about Papdale Woods, we had vital information about the bullet, and he'd give us the false alibi. In my mind, I was clear that Michael was the murderer.
The Procurator Fiscal's office concludes that there is not enough evidence to bring Michael Ross to trial.
Eddie Ross was released after 2 years. He very calmly came back to the island, picked up the pieces, reinvented himself, and got on with his life. You are left with the conclusion that he was the father taking a massive hit in order to try and protect his son.
When Eddie went on trial and was convicted for obstructing the course of justice, Michael's name came up in court as the prime suspect, and that was the first official confirmation we had that Michael was the only one they were looking at. We were interviewing policemen the whole time. I remember after one of the interviews, we stopped the tape, and the policeman said, "We know it was Michael, but unless we can find the gun, we're going to have a really hard time proving it."
I am aware that Michael left school, followed in his father's footsteps, joined the army. I understand he went to Iraq, became a sniper, was commended by the Queen at Buckingham Palace for his sniping duties.
There were doubters. There were people who thought the police were on the wrong track. There's a caucus of people who think that Michael is innocent, probably think Eddie's innocent. I think that the police, were slow to the races, were failing to follow up the proper leads, that they were incompetent. When everything seemed to have gone cold, somebody walked into Kirkwall Police Station with a letter on a sort of lined piece of notepad that seemed to be torn out of a notebook. that started off with, "This is a true letter," and then said he'd been in the public toilets down by the harbour 100 yards from the Mumtaz restaurant, and he'd heard a rustling in one of the cubicles, and the door had opened, and he'd seen someone wearing a balaclava on top of his head and a parka, holding a gun which looked like a Beretta.
The police soon identify the witness as William Grant.
They interviewed him. He identified the chap in the cubicles as Michael Ross. I have no idea why he decided to come forward after 14 years, not after 3 or 5 or 7 or after 20. I don't know why he came forward then. But suddenly everything was go again. The police were back in action, and before we knew it, Michael Ross was in the frame.
Michael Ross is charged with the murder of Shamsuddin Mahmood and stands trial at the High Court in Glasgow.
When people ask me, and they often do, what is the case that I remember out of all the cases I either prosecuted or defended, it's always the case of Michael Ross that I come back to. It was the new evidence of William Grant which was going to be the cornerstone of the case, because there was an identification from him of the assailant with a gun shortly before the incident. And that seemed to be the missing piece of the jigsaw.
He pleaded not guilty to the charge of murder, and his demeanour at the trial actually mirrored that of his father at his trial at the High Court in Inverness in 1997.
Cold cases do sometimes cause problems because obviously within the period of time, in this case 14 years, things have moved on. Michael Ross had moved on from being a 15-year-old boy to being a 29-year-old soldier in the Black Watch. By the time of the trial, he was a married man, he had children. The difficulty was he walked like a soldier, he looked like a soldier. He had plenty of people who came in and gave evidence on his behalf explaining what a good soldier he was. The task of the prosecution was made more difficult in the sense of we had to try and take the jury back to 1994 rather than what they were looking at in 2008.
I think I spent a couple of days in the witness box giving evidence, and it was quite challenging to remember the correct sequence of events and when things happened.
The heart of the prosecution case simply was that this was a racist murder.
What I tried to concentrate on was to introduce the evidence of other people who spoke about Michael at the time, who spoke about what he was like as a boy. There was a body of evidence which suggested that back in the mid-90s, Michael Ross had a tendency perhaps towards being racist. And that was supported in terms of somebody hearing him as part of a group who were making chants of that sort of nature. There was evidence of schoolwork which had swastikas drawn on it.
Michael was a member of the gun club as well and was trained by his dad. In fact, his dad gave him a deactivated submachine gun for a birthday present, stuff like that. So he was very familiar with firearms, you know, target shooting, crack shot, you know, and all that kind of stuff. So to him, you know, he obviously got himself in the mindset, as you would as a sniper. It's not a human being, it's a target.
I thought it was quite a solid case. Personally, I think there was always a sufficiency of evidence, even without William Grant.
6 weeks later, the jury retires to consider the evidence.
It was a Friday when they actually came back to deliver their verdict. And the jury decided that the verdict was one of guilty by majority.
When Michael was found guilty, he then made an escape bid. He leapt from the dock and he ran out of the court in a bid to get away.
He was being taken down towards the cells, then vaulted into the well of the court and headed out of the door.
A court official managed to tackle him and he was very quickly apprehended and brought back.
Several days later, the police discover Michael's car parked at a nearby supermarket.
And when the boot was opened, it was discovered there was machine guns, grenades, all stuff for living rough. That, I think, is what convinced the people of Orkney more that he might have done it rather than being convicted. Why would you do that if you were innocent?
You have to ask yourself, will there ever be an end to this story? You have a father, Eddie Ross, who did jail time, obviously trying to protect his son. You now have his son, Michael, serving time for a brutal and senseless murder, and yet both of them still maintain their innocence and say they are the victims of a conspiracy. This is going to hang over the island, not only for years and years, but decades and decades.
I am as guilty, I think, as everyone else of seeing this case through the prism of Michael Ross rather than any other part of the story. And it's easily done to forget that the real tragedy in this particular case is Mr. Mahmood, who was an innocent bystander. It doesn't matter how you look at the crime. He was a man who had done absolutely nothing but go to his work that day and never came back from it.
I think knowing what we know now, I don't think it could have been anyone if everyone in that restaurant had been white. I think there's no escaping the fact it was a racist murder. I think that Michael was a misguided young man who had access to deadly weapons and chose to use one. I think the Indian restaurant was convenient and Shamal was very unlucky.
To this day, I'm still not clear what Michael's motive was for killing Shamal. He had never had any personal contact with him. He did not know him. Nobody knows. The best I can come up with was he wanted to kill somebody. He's been right into firearms. Who would be the most expendable person in Orkney? He wouldn't want to kill a local Arcadian. So this incomer, who was a waiter, might be the obvious choice, but that's all supposition by me. I still have no idea what the motive was.